This is a short review of the book written by Abiel Livermore, a Northern State New England author, writer, and minister, in his first-hand account and short compiled review of the Mexican-American War of 1846. The book is called The War with Mexico Reviewed and was entered into a writer's competition of the subject, which it had won, and was published in result from the American Peace Society and documented in the Library of Archives as the best review of the Mexican War. As this is only a brief review of the book and only some important quotes and content given, it shall only contain those quotes or references in which, in my opinion, are the best or most important. While most know the war, some also do not. It's often labeled as America's Forgotten War or are ill-informed. This book provides anyone with likely the best understanding and review of that war and shows that indeed, as one can expect, it was a war of aggression and conquest on our part. I will open with the contents and chapters in the book. It is a short read, generally short pages, 310, but they're pretty fast. 32 chapters, and again, pretty short chapters. And I will attach the chapters with all the quotes and shall start with the intro of the book. This is the preface. The conflict with Mexico was short and measured on the scale of European warfare, comparatively insignificant. But in its lessons, it is instructive, and in its effects in forming national character, powerful. To draw good out of its evils, the aim of the American Peace Society and of the work which now goes forth under its auspices. War is the great wrong. Like idolatry, the great spiritual injury must fall in due time before the progress of the gospel. God works by means and men. When was the lowest whisper or prayer unheeded, or the faintest effort unblessed, that ran parallel with his benevolent purposes and his eternal laws? The highest ambition of the writer will be amply satisfied if these pages shall contribute to swell in a small degree the rising tide of public opinion in favor of peace, and awaken a deeper abhorrence for the bloody and needless arbitration of the sword. Then it is undersigned with Abiel Livermore's signature, Keene, New Hampshire, September 11th, 1849. And that is the end of the preface. I shall go to the first quote. And this is number 1 from chapter 2, Circumstances Predisposing to the War with Mexico. This is no sudden leap. This is no mine sprung without warning. On both sides, the elements have been silently brewing through many years for the issues of today. To specify a leading cause, we would advert to what Sir Robert Peel has called in the British Parliament a development of military ambition in the United States. In one sense, both cause and effect with the war with Mexico. The attentive student of history will be at no loss to trace the origin and growth of this fearful passion. Here is quote number 2 from chapter 4, Pretext for War. And as I have said earlier, each chapter has a beginning quote. Some of them do not, but here's one of them. I believe that if the question had been put to Congress before the march of the armies and their actual conflict, not 10 votes could have been obtained in either house for the war with Mexico under the existing state of things. Webster. Now here's a quote from the chapter. The chief motive to this war, however it might be incidentally dropped by incautious lips or pens in the ardor of debate or in the anonymous newspaper article, were yet too culpable to be openly avowed in the documents of a Republican government. More plausible reasons were assigned. The United States were represented as the injured and assaulted party. The war was claimed to be a war of self-defense, but we find now the smoke has cleared away and the excitement is over. We can view things calmly and considerately. What were alleged as reasons for the war with Mexico proved to have been but windy pretenses. Many patriotic and good men of all parties in the United States did not at the time regard them as worthy causes of such fearful consequences. They received in the pointed censure of the wisest and best in the freest countries of Europe. End of that quote. Here's quote number 3, chapter 12, illegitimate barbarities. Here's a quote at the beginning of the chapter. War is also the fruitful parent of crimes. It reverses with respect to its objects all the rules of morality. It is nothing less than a temporary repeal of the principles of virtue. It is a system out of which almost all the virtues are excluded and in which nearly all the vices are included. Robert Hall. Here's a quote from the chapter now. And in order to substantiate the facts under this branch of the subject, we shall quote the testimony of the soldiers and letter writers and confirm their statements by the authentic reports of the commanding generals on both sides. We shall thus see that the Mexican War waged in the 19th century between two professedly free and Christian nations was in most respects no better and probably no worse than the wars of past times. We have said all that can be said when we call it war. A letter from Camargo, January 8th, 1847 says, assassinations, riots, robberies, etc. are so frequent that they do not excite much attention. 9/10 of the Americans here think it is a meritorious act to kill or rob a Mexican, and as large or larger proportion of the latter think it is doing God service to retaliate in kind. Sometimes one side and then the other are the aggressors. Intense and bitter hatred exists on both sides, and the impunity with which crimes are committed operates as a license. There exists a kind of military authority and a species of civil power, neither well defined nor of much efficiency. To enumerate the various acts of violence committed would fill a column or two of your paper and probably not do much good. That's the end of that quote. We are on to quote number 4 now, chapter 17, the New Territories. And here's a quote at the beginning of the chapter. And what in principle is war? It is the duel between nations, differing in no respect from the duel between individuals, except that the successful combatant is allowed to carry off as spoil the effects of his vanquished antagonist. Bishop Potter. Here's a quote from the chapter. We may then classify the territory among the political evils resulting from the Mexican War. We had more land before than we could settle and till for years to come. We had room enough and to spare. The new territories have introduced new topics of dispute. They will require a large standing army for their protection from the Indians and others. They expose our boundaries to perpetual inroads. They are not themselves generally very valuable, except in certain narrow tracts that minister to the auri sacra fames, the accursed hunger for gold. We have compelled many thousands of people in those regions to come under our government, which is far from practicing on the doctrine of civil and religious liberty, and basing government on the consent of the governed. And so far as we have unjustly by might and not right acquired possessions of parts of Tamaulipas, Chihuahua, Coahuila, and all of New Mexico and Upper California, we must sooner or later suffer the most condign punishment for this gigantic wrong. As surely as there is a God reigning in heaven, or providence taking note of human conduct, the day cannot be far remote when we shall be overtaken by the penalty of the law we have broken. Every interest of our beloved country, social, penitentiary, political, domestic, and moral, has felt the shock of this war. The eagle eye of liberty has drooped in sadness at the triumphs of oppression, and the religion whose interdict is, "Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's," veils her holy face in abhorrence at the apostasy of her professed children. That's the end of that quote. We're on quote number 5. Chapter 17, the new territories. This chapter did not have a quote at the beginning, so I'll just go from the quote from the chapter. These lands we have seen were as much forced from Mexico against their will as the robber's booty is extorted from the helpless traveler by arms and threats. We beat, we threatened, we coaxed Mexico to do what was against her wishes and interests. Can such treasures thus procured carry a blessing to their rapacious possessors? Not if life has one lesson to teach. Not if there is any truth in God's word. Not if providence has any oversight over human affairs. Ill-gotten riches, when as a general rule have they ever benefited individuals or nations? Enterprise is spoken of, but had we not already a country resting on two remote oceans? Was there any lack of room? Must we cast coveted eyes on our neighbors' lands because we are a progressive people? Read the history of the nations which have most abounded in the precious metals. Read the tales of California life thus far developed, and then let the true lover of his country, let the friend of freedom and free institutions say whether, if he were to select any mode of retribution for the stupendous folly and crime of such a war, he could devise anyone that under a fascinating disguise carries a Pandora's box of greater evils, and the acquisition of the gold lands of the Sacramento. The ancient saying may be fulfilled. He gave them their request, but he sent leanness into their souls. Who that reviews the violent and fraudulent means employed to revolutionize and conquer California could look with honest complacency on the gold coins stamped with that appellation? Who that understands in any measure what makes a state, what constitutes the true grandeur of nations, must lament with an unusual bitterness of sorrow that breaking away from the high promise. And that is the end of the crucial and important chapters for the readers. I shall finish with some remaining quotes and references besides the previous, to which are, in my opinion, also crucial, stand out, or are important. Here is one from the chapter Political Evils of the War Abroad. We had already done great discredit to our good name by our violation of Indian treaties, our slavery, and our repudiation of state debts. But this attack on weak neighbors is capping the climax of wrong and dishonor. See, says the monarchist, the aristocrat, your boasted government of the people can do as wicked and unjust things as were ever perpetrated by the kings and kaisers of the old world. It is the same game of ambition, only it is played by different hands. It is the ancient spirit in new form. The reality is the same, sugar it over with fair names as much as you please. War is war, and tyranny is tyranny, and slavery is slavery, whether in the United States or Rome or England. We have shown that the eagle has claws as sharp as the tooth of the lion or the paw of the bear. Mexico may not fall. The blow she has received may raise her latent energies of self-improvement. But if the period should ever arrive when the largest republic on earth, next to our own, Mexico, and the most hopeful and consistent one, is blotted out of the record of nations and becomes the Poland of the West, we shall stand condemned in the eyes of heaven and our own as authors of so tremendous a catastrophe. We hesitate not to say on these and previous testimonies that the Texas plot was one of the darkest conspiracies that history anywhere records. That is the end of that. I have another one right here. This is from the chapter, The War Spirit and the Gospel of Christ. The inconsistency of our invasion of Mexico with the Christian faith has been brought into a stronger contrast from the fact that at the very moment we were loading down a vessel of war to the very edge with breadstuffs for the famishing Irish and dispatching them on this mission of mercy, we were sending bomb ships laden with the most destructive implements of war to lay waste the cities of Mexico and bury men, women, and children in the ruins of their dwellings and churches. It is a serious inquiry for every Christian whether, while we have thus been aiding fatal blows at the physical life of a sister republic, we may not have placed ourselves in the way of receiving the fruits of spiritual death in ourselves. And this one doesn't have a chapter, but I will read it either way. I believe it was from the previous chapter too. Sermons which are now before us were preached both on the Rio Grande and at the City of Mexico before the troops, justifying the war, talking largely of the Anglo-Saxon destiny, comparing the progress of the American arms with the entrance of the children of Israel into the land of Canaan, and giving the sanctions and benedictions of Christianity to the awful wrongs and barbarities of one of the most cruel, sanguinary, and demoralizing wars on record. Here is another chapter from the chapter Preparation for War. The reason assigned for the war were but pretenses, covering ulterior designs which would not do at once to disclose, but which have in due succession all come out and now stand in their naked deformity before the world. Conquest, dismemberment, and annexation of new territory, the extension of slavery, the domestic slave trade, and the slave power. A distinguished statesman with equal truth and severity characterized the war as a war of pretext. What can prevent it from occupying that position on the pages of candid and impartial history? Here is another from the chapter Expenditures of the War. When we look too on one hand at the horrid destitution and consequent degradation and wretchedness of extended strata of society in the old world, and then witness on the other the fruitful cause, indirect or indirect, of this incalculable woe, in the war debts which hang like the Alps and Andes around the necks of the European powers, we would utter a cry that should pierce the hearts of our countrymen and warn them from the ambition of copying into their unwritten history so dark a chapter. If a whole nation will expend without reluctance their kingly treasures, one that might constitute the moral lever to raise earth in the acts of human butchery and misery, in conquest and invasion, what title has it to be called a Christian nation? It has none. It is a heathen people with a Christian cloak. I was cut off on the last one, but I will continue. This is from chapter 14, Illegalities, and there's a quote: "Laws are silent in war." Cicero. Numerous unlawful acts preceded the war. The conquest of Mexican territory by citizens of the United States with the connivance, if not the aid, of the national and state government was contrary to the law of nations. The seizure of Monterey in California, October 19, 1842, by Commodore Jones, was a lawless act disavowed indeed by the government, but the perpetrator was never punished. The annexation of Texas by a joint resolution was contrary to our treaty with Mexico, to the Comity of Nations, and to the Constitution of the United States. The act of war at first was illegal. It was a violation of the law of nations to enter a disputed territory and hold it by force of arms when it was fully conceded that it was debatable ground, and when we had recognized in the same territory by specific acts of Congress. The origin of the war was also contrary to the Constitution of the United States. By this instrument, it is reserved to Congress to declare war, repel invasions. The progress of the war was attended by many proceedings as much at variance with the laws of man as the laws of God. For the details, we refer to other chapters of this work. The object of the war was an illegal and unconstitutional one. There are provisions in the Constitution to repel invasions, but not to make them. Far as heaven is from earth was the thought of the framers of that instrument, from sanctioning by one syllable of theirs the spirit of conquest. And there is a poem from the book I shall read. There's two actually. This one's from a Mexican poet writing at the beginning of the war, Jose Ho Ace de Saltillo. Hearken, from our northern borders, sound Arista's bugle call. On the banks of the Rio Bravo, bursts the shell and plows the ball. Ghastly hounds in Tenochtitlan strike the old Aztec battle drum. Sharp of beak and strong of talon, lo, Mexitil's eagles come. Coldly sleep our slaughtered brothers, while above their hasty graves sounds the hurrying hoof of rapine, and the robber banner waves. On they come, the mad invaders, like the fire before the wind. Freedom's harvest field before them, slavery's blackened waste behind them. From the sellers of God's image, from the traffickers in man, Mother gracious, Mother holy, shield thy dark browed Mexican. Hearken, up the Rio Bravo, comes the Negro catcher's shout. Listen, 'tis the Yankee's hammer forging human fetters out. Let the land we love be wasted, black with fire and rough with graves. Better far for God and freedom die at once than live as slaves. And this is another poem from the book called Yorktown, entitled Yorktown, referring to the compromises of the Constitution and the perpetuation of slavery in the United States. Whittier breaks forth in these stanzas. O fields still green and fresh in story, old days of pride, old names of glory, old marvels of the tongue and pen, old thoughts which stirred the hearts of men. Ye spared the wrong, and over all, behold the avenging shadow fall. Your worldwide honor stained with shame, your freedom's self a hollow name. Where is now the flag of that old war? Where flows its stripes? Where burns its star? Bear witness, Palo Alto's day, dark veil of palms, red Monterey, where men's freedom, young and weak, fleshes the northern eagle's beak. Symbol of terror and despair, of chains and slaves, go seek it there. Laugh, Prussia, midst thy iron ranks. Laugh, Russia, from thy Neva's banks. Brave sport to see the fledgling born, of freedom by its parents torn. Safe now your Spielberg's dungeon cell, safe drear Siberia's frozen hell. With slavery's flag over both unrolled, what of the new world fears of the old? That is the end of the quotes and poems from The War with Mexico Reviewed by Abiel Livermore. And I have another additional quote which is related but is not from the book. This is from a speech by Mr. Corwin of Ohio to the Department of Military Affairs regarding the war with Mexico. It is not to say, Mr. Polk, sir, you have done wrong. You have assumed responsibilities that did not belong to you. You should have submitted all the facts in regard to Mexico to Congress. Thereupon it would have been its duty to consider what was the true policy to adopt. Did Mr. Polk do this? No, sir. Omnipotent as the right arm of despotism itself, guided on by selfish and ambitious men, he, in a rash and imbecile manner, plants less than 3,000 troops before the city of Matamoros. Yes, sir. In the beginning of the summer, when Congress was in session, without counsel, direction, or advice, money or men, except the peace establishment, for thus attacking a superior force of Mexicans without orders, we are informed that Captain Thornton, who commanded the dragoons, was arrested and tried by a court-martial, and the record of that proceeding may now be found in the War Department. Thus it appears most conclusively that the assertions of the President that the war was not provoked by the United States and that Mexico commenced hostilities are unfounded and untrue. Sir, I feel that the duty of exposing these misrepresentations of the executive is unpleasant, but it is, nevertheless, imperative. Undersigned, Mr. Corwin of Ohio. And that is the end of the short review of The War with Mexico Reviewed. If you would like to read the book, you could find it online in the Library of Congress archives under The War with Mexico Reviewed by Abiel Livermore by the American Peace Society. Thank you.